If we look at Samuel Johnson's mid-18th century A Dictionary of the English Language, we will find sex neatly defined in two parts. Firstly, as the property by which any animal is male or female, and secondly, as womankind by way of emphasis. Notably missing is sex as a noun referencing sexual intercourse, which, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, wasn't a thing until 1900 when H.G. Wells used it that way in his Love and Mr. Lewisham, and it wasn't until 1929 that D.H. Lawrence introduced the earliest recorded use of the phrase to have sex into English with his poem Pansies. If you want to have sex, you've got to trust at the core of your heart the other creature. Anyway, if we look further down in Johnson's dictionary, we will find that there is something missing. There is sextuple and there is shab, but in between them we find absolutely no trace of the term sexuality. In fact, the word sexuality was not recorded until the end of the 18th century, when it was first used in John Walker's 1797 Elements of Geography and of Natural and Civil History, in which Walker states that the Linnaean system is founded on the sexuality of plants. It wasn't until 1833 that it was used more specifically to reference humans in Andrew Pickens's 1833 Traditionary Stories of Old Families. This, like most matters of love and sexuality, became the bitter bottoming of many sorrows. Even here it wasn't being used in the way we use it today. The use of the word to recognise that humans have different sexual identities first entered the English language in 1897 in the English translation of the physician Havelock Ellis's book, Sexual Inversion. It was the first medical textbook in English to investigate homosexuality, a word that had been coined in German 29 years earlier in 1868 by the Hungarian journalist Karl-Maria. Kirkpenny had also coined the terms monosexual, heterogeneous, and heterosexual. Monosexual and heterogeneous are essentially lost terms nowadays. Respectively, they mean someone who masturbates and someone who has sex with animals, but they never became common usage. Homosexual and heterosexual, however, are still alive and well, although the meaning of heterosexual has undergone considerable change. The earliest known use of heterosexual in the US was in an 1892 article by Dr. James G. Kernan, in which he describes heterosexuality as an abnormal manifestation of the sexual appetite in a list of sexual perversions. By 1923, Merriam-Webster's dictionary was still defining heterosexuality as a morbid sexual passion for one of the opposite sex, and it wasn't until 1934 that the definition of heterosexuality changed to something more familiar to us today, with that year's version of Merriam-Webster's dictionary finally defining it as a manifestation of sexual passion for one of the opposite sex, i.e. normal sexuality. So, what happened here? There have always been gay people. We have enough records of their passage through the criminal justice system to prove it. So why did it take so long for the language needed to talk about them to come into existence? To understand this, we need to understand paradigm shifts. A paradigm shift is when one model or system of thought about a topic is replaced by another. When it comes to sexuality, there have been, according to the historian Veronica Mottier, 2 paradigm shifts in modernity to 3 different systems of thought surrounding sexuality. The first shift was from a moral religious model to a biological medical one, and the second, the one we are currently undergoing, from a biological medical model to a cultural social model. Let's look at the moral religious model first. Sex has not always been society's chief moral concern. In antiquity, what they were mostly concerned about was food, not sex, due to an economy of scarcity. It was Christianity that changed this and placed sex at the centre of morality by declaring it to be responsible for the transmittance of the original sin. Jesus had surprisingly little to say about sex in the Bible, but one of the most dominant figures of the early church, the Apostle Paul, was ready to fill that gap. Paul believed that the second coming was imminent and that people should remain absolutely celibate until then. But Paul was a pragmatist and recognised that not everyone would be able to do this. So in Corinthians he wrote, "Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Essentially, Paul was just about ready to accept that people probably wouldn't be able to remain celibate for the rest of their lives, and if that was the case, then they should at least keep their sexual indulgences to the marriage bed, lest they burn in hell. Later church fathers were less understanding than Paul. St. Jerome taught that all sexual relations were unclean, even inside marriage. "Everything is poison which bears within it the seeds of sensual pleasure." Thus, as Christianity took over as the official religion of the Roman Empire, old Roman laws that encouraged men and women to marry and punish them if they did not have children were replaced as the Christian ideal of celibacy took centre stage. Unfortunately for the early Christians, nobody discovered a way to reproduce whilst avoiding sex completely, so the new Christian Roman lawmakers were forced to tolerate it sometimes, but they still focused on restricting the number of ways it could be legally engaged in. Marriage was formalised, concubinage outlawed, and divorce made much harder to accomplish. The first anti-gay law in the Western world was also put into force by Constantius II and his brother Constans, who was likely gay himself, in 342 AD. What is a man after when he lies embracing with a man as with a woman, when difference of sex disappears, when there is a crime which it does not pay to know, when Venus is changed to some other form, when love is asked for without being seen? We order the laws to rise up, and statutes to be armed with the sword of an avenger, so that those who are now or hereafter guilty may become infamous, and be subjected to the most exquisite punishment. As time went on, Christian attitudes towards various sexual acts varied from parish to parish, but they had much in common, and we can learn about general trends in these attitudes from documents called penitentials. Penitentials originated in 6th century Ireland, where the Celtic missionary St. Columbanus wrote the first one and brought it to England and the continent. Penitentials were essentially catalogues of sins with corresponding penances depending on the severity of the sin, and priests would consult these penitentials when hearing confessions. The penitentials could get insanely detailed. One 11th century penitential required that priests asked men, "Have you coupled with your wife or another woman from behind like dogs?" The same book advised that priests hearing a woman's confession ask about a variety of subjects, from aphrodisiacs to the possible use of their menstrual blood as a love charm. In 821 AD, Theodulf of Orleans even warned confessors not to put ideas into people's heads with overly detailed questions. There are many vices recorded in the penitential which it is not proper for a person to know. Therefore, the priest ought not to question him about everything, lest perhaps when he goes away he be persuaded by the devil to fall into one of the crimes of which he had been previously ignorant. We can learn how poorly various activities were viewed depending upon how severe the penances were for them. Surprisingly, bestiality was treated rather lightly in the earliest penitentials, perhaps reflecting people's close proximity to livestock. At first, it was treated as no worse than masturbation. Boys confessing to bestiality were given only 40 days penance, and adults were ordered to do a year's penance. A man who had sex with a pig was deemed to be less offensive to God than a man who had anal sex with his wife, and in some regions, women were given a longer period of penance for performing fellatio on a man than for killing him outright, although the secular authorities might also have had something to say about that. In fact, the price of a blowjob was higher in some places than it was for two men having anal sex, with the blowjob resulting in potentially lifelong penances, whilst the two men could be given as little as 3 years. Generally, however, sexual behaviour was considered ideal if it took place inside a marriage for the purposes of procreation, and not on any of the many days that sex was forbidden, including in the first 3 days of marriage, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, the 3 Lents, the weeks following Easter, the days preceding the Pentecost, the 2 months around Christmas, and hundreds of other holy days. Eventually, penitentials lost a lot of their influence around the 12th century, being replaced by general laws enforced by formal courts, and men who had anal sex with other men began to face far worse punishments after the turn of the millennium than before it. This was not necessarily due to a change in the religious framework itself, however. The focus was still on sex ideally being between a married couple for the purpose of procreation. However, as crusade after crusade failed and plague after plague decimated the European population, Christendom began to look for scapegoats, and found them in various forms. Muslims, Jews, witches, etc. were all blamed for denying God, working to harm Christian society, and indulging in supposed immoral forms of sex, including sodomy. It was claimed that Muhammad introduced sodomy to the Arabs in the 7th century, and the First Crusade began after a fake letter purportedly written by the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos urged the Christian kingdoms of Europe to save the Holy Land from the Muslims who, the letter emphasized, were sodomizing men of every age and rank. This introduced new associations with sodomy, as throughout the Middle Ages Islam became synonymous in the West with deviant sexual practices. None of this really changed the religious moral framework in terms of views about which forms of sex were deviant and which were allowed. However, it did change the severity of the crimes, as Christians engaged in sodomy, a crime which could have a number of meanings, went from being seen as having committed an act of personal sin which could be forgiven by paying penance, to having committed a sin so terrible that it could bring calamity to an entire community, if said community did not persecute those responsible for it, just as God had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. An example of this kind of thinking can be seen in the words of an early modern minister discussing women who bore illegitimate children, who described the act as a filthy act of whoredom, by the which licentious life of hers, not only God's wrath may be poured down upon us inhabitants of the town, but also her evil example may so greatly corrupt others, that great and extraordinary charge for the maintenance of base-born children may be imposed upon us. Similarly, the rationale for harsh laws against adulterers was explained. If these grave sins are not prevented or punished with all possible energy and seriousness, Almighty God will be greatly offended and angered, and will be moved to send and inflict all manner of serious, immediate war, unrest, and other countrywide punishments. And, possibly most explicitly, in 1458, the Venetian Council of Ten introduced a piece of legislation designed to control sodomy with the following. As it is clear from divine scripture that our omnipotent God, detesting the sin of sodomy and wishing to demonstrate that fact, brought down his wrath upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and soon thereafter flooded and destroyed the whole world for such horrible sins, our most wise ancestors sought with all their laws and efforts to liberate our city from such a dangerous divine judgment. In 1467, the city of Venice began requiring that doctors and barbers report all cases in which their young or female patients' hindquarters showed excessive wear and tear. To eliminate the vice of sodomy from this city is worth every concern, and as there are many women who consent to this vice, and are broken in the rear parts, and also many boys are so broken, and all those treated, yet still none are accused, and their deeds go unpunished. Therefore, because it is wise to honour God, those who are broken in these parts, be they boys or women, are to be denounced. Most instances of sodomy in 15th century Venice involved two men, but it seems that Venetian women would occasionally accuse their husbands of sodomy. This was often difficult for the wives to prove, and the Council of Ten tended to be suspicious of such complaints. But after the 1467 ruling, the next two cases involving married couples resulted in conviction for the man. In the case of Giorgio di Giurasto, he was sentenced to 4 years of exile, but in the case of Giovanni Furlan, who was found guilty of frequent sodomy with his own wife, he was beheaded and his remains were burned. In Bruges, there were at least 90 executions for sodomy between the years 1385 and 1515, whereas in 15th century Ghent there were only 8 executions for sodomy, including 3 women. After 1524, when the Spanish Inquisition finally got permission to handle cases of supposed sodomy, there followed decades of executions pursued zealously by the Inquisition. In one case, 12 men were publicly burned to death at once, 9 of them for engaging with mules and donkeys, and the other 3 for sodomy with other men. Over the following decades, several men were also burned for having anal sex with their wives. Later, in 1699, a man named Thomas Davis was put on trial for the crime of sodomy. Likewise, Davis had not committed sodomy with a man, but with a woman, a spinster named Charity Parrott. The record shows that Thomas Davis of the parish of St. James, Westminster, was indicted for felony, for that he, the 5th of June last, did make an assault upon one Charity Parrott, spinster, and with her, against the order of nature, had venery, and with her did commit and perpetrate that abominable sin called buggery, not fit to be named. In 1721, the Prussian Katharina Margareta Link, who had dressed as a man and started calling themselves Anastasius Lagrantius Rosenstengel, met and married a woman called Katharina Margareta Mulhahn, and used a leather strap-on to have sex with her. In court, Mulhahn claimed that Link had tortured and tormented her during intercourse, and that her inquiries into Link's anatomy had been met with threats of violence. But she also described having examined Link once in 1717 while she slept, and discovered that she was a woman. In the end, Link was beheaded for sodomy, and it was recommended that Mulhahn be tortured for further information, but in the end she was imprisoned for 3 years and then banished. So it is clear that in the moral religious paradigm, sexual acts were considered sinful and punishable if they were thought likely to bring the wrath of God upon the community, which was almost certainly the case if an act was not procreative and didn't happen between 2 married people, although the severity of the punishment depended on where you lived and a number of other factors, including your age and the time period you were born into. Whilst in the early Middle Ages you may get away with 3 years of penance if you were a man performing anal sex with another man, if you were born into the late Middle Ages or into the early modern period, you were more likely to suffer death, which, if you were lucky, could be quick, or if you were unlucky, could be agonizingly painful. The religious moral paradigm is still with us today, of course, but as the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment secularized society created large urban masses in which individuals were less exposed to the social and religious controls of traditional pre-modern communities, and reason began to displace religion, another model of thought about sex began to develop alongside it, eventually superseding it: the biological medical model. In 1791, during the First French Revolution, the revolutionaries introduced a penal code which effectively decriminalized sodomy by simply not mentioning it at all. Their decriminalization of sodomy resulted not from the sudden acceptance of sodomy by the French populace, but a focus on legislation which ignored all victimless crimes and promised less governmental interference into people's personal affairs. This was possible due to their focus on reason rather than religion in their decision-making. However, the French revolutionaries were an outlier in their age, and it was just as common for reason to be used to justify traditional Christian morals. In 1757, the Swiss physician Samuel Tissot was rushed to the bedside of a young watchmaker who, having engaged in masturbation as many as 3 times per day, feared for his life due to the resulting loss of semen. Tissot described what he saw when he got there. "What I found was less a living being than a cadaver lying on straw, thin, pale, exuding a loathsome stench, almost incapable of movement. A pale and watery blood often dripped from his nose. He drooled continually. Subject to attacks of diarrhea, he defecated in his bed without noticing it. There was a constant flow of semen. His eyes, sticky, blurry, dull, had lost all power of movement. His pulse was extremely weak and racing. Laboured respiration, extreme emaciation except for the feet, which were showing signs of edema. Mental disorder was equally evident, without ideas, without memory. Thus sunk below the level of a beast, a spectacle of unimaginable horror. It was difficult to believe that he had once belonged to the human race." Tissot's experience with the watchmaker arose in him the desire to show young people the errors of their ways, so he wrote a medical treatise, Lonenism, a book that used not religion, although Christianity had since the first penitentials considered masturbation to be sinful, but science to justify anti-masturbation sentiment. Tissot characterized masturbation as medically harmful, claiming that when semen was not preserved, the body slowed down and eventually stopped. Tissot's book became famous. It was translated into English, German, Italian, and Dutch, and became a standard reference work. The 150-year period that followed, ending just after World War I, has actually been called the Age of Masturbatory Insanity. In the middle of the 19th century, Darwin published his theory of evolution in On the Origin of Species. That sexual selection was the key to evolution became a driving force for the development of modern sexual science, and scientific investigations focused on questions of heredity, degeneracy, and race. It is no coincidence that the earlier mentioned Havelock Ellis, who published the first study on homosexuality in English, was a eugenicist. Growing concerns about public health, in particular prostitution, personal hygiene, and venereal disease, also contributed to research on sex, which in turn became closely intertwined with increasing state intervention on sexual matters, as understood from a biological rather than a religious perspective. The concept of sexuality was invented. Sexual behavior was explained as the result of natural biological drives to reproduce, and scientific explanations were sought for sexualities considered deviant. Chief amongst these explanations was the belief that supposedly deviant sexualities were caused by physical and mental illness and degeneracy. When James G. Kiernan defined heterosexuality as a sexual perversion, it was because of this belief that natural sexual behavior was the result of biological drives to reproduce, thus making sex between a man and a woman abnormal if done for pleasure rather than reproduction. It was only as recently as the 1920s that heterosexual sex for pleasure rather than procreation began to be seen as normal. So, the biological medical model brought with it new categories of human. Whereas in the moral religious model it was assumed that anyone, man or woman, could become a sodomite if, it was supposed, they were sufficiently lacking in morality, the biological model conceptualized those who committed such acts as suffering from a type of disease, homosexuality. To be a homosexual was to be othered in a way that there was no coming back from. The homosexual, it was supposed, had abnormal biological instincts which, it was argued, needed to be cured. Potential cures were suggested and tried in the forms of therapy and chemical and surgical interventions, including castration. It wasn't until 1973 that homosexuality was taken out of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, when it was argued that mental illness had not been clearly defined. Campaigners pressed to define it as a mental condition which causes distress or impairs social functioning, such as finding and maintaining a job or a relationship. As gay activists demonstrated that they were productive members of society able to find gainful employment and maintain relationships, it was clear that homosexuality could no longer be classified as a mental illness. It was similarly unclassified as a mental illness by the World Health Organization in 1992 and in the UK in 1994. In the 2020s, it is largely accepted that homophobia, rather than homosexuality, is the real problem, but the biological model of understanding sexuality is still with us today. So, what about the third model of sexuality, the cultural model? In the 1980s, the biological model came under attack as the importance of culture was recognized in a number of disciplines. Theoretical models focusing on the cultural nature of sexual experience rather than natural or biological explanations were put forward. In the cultural model, sexuality is not just the expression of biological instincts, but is socially and politically constructed. In anthropology, culture is understood as the capacity for symbolic thinking and communication, which is revealed through knowledge, beliefs, behavior, and products. This includes sexual behavior, so whilst sex may be a biological urge, sexual behavior and the meaning of those behaviors differs considerably cross-culturally. One of the most universal taboos in human civilization is incest. However, the definition of incest varies across cultures. With the exception of certain monarchies, such as in ancient Egypt where the pharaoh marrying his sister, as was done by Tutankhamun in marrying his half-sister Ankhesenamun, sexual relations between parents and children and between siblings are seemingly universally forbidden. However, things are less clear when it comes to other members of the family. In the Netherlands, it is legal to marry and sleep with your aunt or uncle, but in Florida, doing so constitutes a felony. In the UK, it is legal to marry and sleep with your first cousins, but in ancient China, first cousins with the same surnames were not permitted to marry, although you could marry first cousins with different surnames. The differences in what is considered incest are not biological, but cultural. In many areas of the world, nudity in adults is considered polluting. In 2002, a group of Nigerian women successfully occupied an oil rig by threatening to remove their clothes. The act of revealing their vaginas was far from being considered sexually desirable by the men on the oil rig. Rather, it was understood as a form of curse in which the women essentially communicated, "This is where life comes from. I hereby revoke your life." Many men who shared the cultural beliefs of those women believed that the act would actually cause their deaths. And what about breasts? In the 1951 Patterns of Sexual Behavior by Cleland Ford and Frank Beach, breasts were only considered sexually important to men in 13 of 191 cultures they studied. 9 cultures preferred large breasts, 2 preferred long pendulous breasts, and another 2 liked breasts that were upright and hemispherical. 13 cultures also reported breast stimulation during sex, but only 3 of those cultures overlap with the societies where men found breasts important for sexual attraction. And in Breastfeeding, Biocultural Perspectives, edited by Aldine de Gruyter, Catherine Detweiler, a cultural anthropologist, said that friends from Mali had been bemused and horrified when she had described sexual foreplay involving breasts to them. So it seems that even sexual attraction to boobs can be culturally influenced. And of course, there are dozens more examples, from Trobriand Islanders biting off their partner's eyelashes whilst making love, to Bakweri women of Cameroon exposing their vaginas as a form of political protest. However, the question all these examples raise is how far a person's culture, rather than their biology, informs their sexual behaviour. Is it true that, as put across in Patricia Kaplan's The Cultural Construction of Sexuality, what people want and what they do in any society is to a large extent what they are made to want and allowed to do? What do you think? Leave a comment down below with your thoughts, and if you enjoyed the video, remember to give it a like and subscribe for future content. If you want to support the channel further, check out my Patreon in the description below, and I'll see you next time.